Marcus Chen stood in his corner office on the 45th floor, looking down at the city that had made him a billionaire before his 40th birthday. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from board members, investors, and executives seeking his approval on million-dollar deals. None of it mattered right now. His mind was elsewhere, trapped in a memory from 3 months ago when everything in his perfectly constructed life had started to crack. The marriage to Victoria had been strategic from the start. She came from old money, the kind that opened doors even his billions could not. Their wedding had been featured in every major magazine, and their life together looked flawless from the outside. But Marcus knew the truth. They slept in separate bedrooms. They spoke only when necessary. Victoria spent her days at charity galas and spa appointments while Marcus built his empire. Then came the announcement that changed everything. Victoria was pregnant. Marcus remembered the carefully staged photo shoot, the way she posed with her hand on her barely visible belly, the practiced smile that never reached her eyes. Something about it all felt wrong, but he pushed the feeling aside. A child would complete the image they had crafted for the world. The pregnancy progressed normally, or so everyone said. Victoria visited Dr. Raymond Harrison, the most expensive obstetrician in the city. The doctor had delivered babies for celebrities, politicians, and royalty. His word was considered gospel in their social circle. Every appointment brought the same report. Mother and baby were perfectly healthy. Marcus tried to be involved. He went to a few ultrasounds, saw the grainy images that supposedly showed his child. Victoria always seemed irritated by his presence at these appointments, insisting he was too busy to waste time on routine checkups. Eventually, he stopped going. Work consumed him anyway, and Victoria seemed to prefer handling the pregnancy alone. The baby was born on a Tuesday morning in March. Marcus was in Tokyo closing a deal worth $200 million when he got the call. He took the first flight home, arriving at the hospital 12 hours after the birth. The private suite looked more like a hotel room than a hospital, with flowers already arranged in crystal vases and champagne on ice. Victoria lay in the bed, looking tired but triumphant. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in pink blankets. A girl. Marcus approached slowly, his heart pounding in a way that no business deal had ever made it pound. When he looked down at his daughter's face, he felt something shift inside him. The baby had deep brown skin, much darker than either his or Victoria's light complexion. Marcus stared, his mind racing. Victoria's explanation came quickly, smoothly, as if rehearsed. She talked about recessive genes, about her great-grandmother who had been from the Caribbean, about how genetics could surprise people. Dr. Harrison, standing beside the bed, nodded along, adding medical terms that sounded authoritative. Marcus wanted to believe it. He tried to push away the doubt that gnawed at him. But when he held his daughter for the first time, looking into her dark eyes, he could not shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Still, he said nothing. What could he say in that moment, surrounded by nurses and doctors with Victoria watching him carefully? They named her Sophie. Marcus threw himself into being a father, perhaps hoping that love would erase his doubts. He hired the best nanny, bought the most expensive baby items, and created a nursery that looked like something from a magazine. But every time he looked at Sophie, the questions returned. Victoria became increasingly distant after bringing Sophie home. She rarely held the baby, leaving most of the care to the nanny. When Marcus tried to discuss his concerns about Sophie's appearance, Victoria became angry, accusing him of being racist, of not understanding genetics, of trying to avoid his responsibilities as a father. So Marcus stayed silent. He loved Sophie despite his doubts. The little girl had stolen his heart from that first moment. She smiled at him, reached for him with tiny fingers, and made sounds that melted his hardened businessman exterior. Whether or not she was biologically his, he could not imagine life without her. The truth came in the most unexpected way. Marcus was working from home on a Friday afternoon when the regular nanny called in sick. A substitute nanny arrived, a young woman named Grace who came highly recommended by the agency. She was a black woman in her mid-20s with kind eyes and a gentle manner with Sophie. Sophie, now 3 months old, took to Grace immediately. Marcus watched from his home office as Grace played with the baby, singing softly and making her laugh. There was something about the way Grace looked at Sophie, a flash of recognition that Marcus caught but could not quite understand. That evening, after Victoria had left for another charity event, Marcus found Grace sitting in the nursery, tears streaming down her face as she held Sophie. He started to ask what was wrong, but Grace quickly wiped her eyes and apologized. She said something about missing her own family, about how babies always made her emotional. Marcus did not believe her. He had not built a billion-dollar company by missing the small details, the tiny tells that revealed when someone was hiding something. Grace knew something about Sophie. He was certain of it. Over the next week, Grace continued to come as the regular nanny recovered from the flu. Marcus observed her carefully. She was professional, excellent with Sophie, but there were moments when she would stare at the baby with such longing and pain that it was impossible to miss. On Grace's last day, Marcus made a decision. He waited until Sophie was napping, then asked Grace to speak with him privately in his office. She looked terrified, clutching her bag as if ready to run. Marcus spoke gently, assuring her she was not in trouble. He simply asked her to tell him the truth about why she cried that first night. Grace hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty to her profession and something deeper. Finally, she spoke. Her words came out in a rush as if she had been holding them back for too long. She told Marcus that she had a younger sister, barely 18 years old, who had gotten involved with the wrong people. The sister had been struggling with addiction, living on the streets desperate for money. 6 months ago, Grace's sister had disappeared. Grace searched everywhere, filed police reports, and checked hospitals. Then, 3 months ago, her sister called. She was clean, living in a facility, and had just given birth to a baby girl, but the baby was gone. Her sister said that a doctor had arranged everything, had paid her a large sum of money, and had taken the baby immediately after birth. Grace's voice broke as she described how her sister had been too ashamed to give details, how she had used the money to get into rehab, and was now trying to rebuild her life. But she had told Grace about the baby, about her dark skin and dark eyes, about how she had only held her for a few moments before they took her away. When Grace saw Sophie, she knew immediately. The resemblance to her sister was unmistakable. She had wanted to say something, but who would believe a nanny making accusations against one of the richest families in the city? Marcus sat frozen, his world tilting on its axis. He asked Grace for her sister's name and contact information. Grace hesitated, then wrote down the details with shaking hands. She begged Marcus not to get her sister in trouble, explaining that the girl had been taken advantage of in her most vulnerable moment. After Grace left, Marcus stared at the paper in his hands. Everything suddenly made sense. Victoria's strange behavior during the pregnancy, Dr. Harrison's constant reassurances, the way Victoria avoided holding Sophie. The expensive doctor had lied. His wife had paid for a baby, and some young woman struggling with addiction had been exploited for her child. Marcus looked at the closed door of the nursery where Sophie slept peacefully. Rage and protectiveness surged through him in equal measure. This little girl was innocent in all of this. She had been bought and sold like property, and somewhere out there was a young mother who had been manipulated into giving up her baby. He picked up his phone, his hand steady despite the storm raging inside him. He had built an empire by being strategic, by planning every move carefully, but this time it was not about business. This was about his daughter, about truth, and about making sure that everyone who had participated in this deception faced the consequences. The investigation would start with Dr. Harrison. Marcus had resources that most people could not imagine. Private investigators, lawyers who specialized in medical fraud, contacts in every level of government and law enforcement. By morning, he would have a team assembled. By the end of the week, he would have evidence. But first, he walked into the nursery and picked up Sophie. She stirred slightly, her tiny hand grasping his finger. Marcus made her a promise in that moment. He would uncover the truth, no matter how painful. He would find her biological mother and make sure she got the help she needed. And he would make absolutely certain that Victoria and Dr. Harrison paid for what they had done. The storm was coming, and Marcus Chen was going to make sure it swept away every lie that had been built around his daughter's birth. Marcus spent the entire weekend making calls and setting his plan in motion. By Monday morning, he had assembled a team that included 2 private investigators, a lawyer specializing in adoption fraud, and a forensic accountant who could track money trails that most people thought were impossible to follow. The first priority was confirming Grace's story. Marcus sent his lead investigator, a former FBI agent named Sarah Mitchell, to find Grace's sister. It took less than 48 hours. The young woman, whose name was Jasmine, was living in a rehabilitation facility on the outskirts of the city. She was 19 years old, clean for 3 months, and terrified when Sarah approached her with questions about her baby. Sarah recorded the interview with Jasmine's permission. Marcus watched the video in his office, his jaw clenching tighter with every word. Jasmine described how she had been living in a shelter when a woman approached her. The woman said she worked for a doctor who helped women in difficult situations. She offered Jasmine money, a place to stay, and medical care throughout her pregnancy. Jasmine had been 5 months pregnant at the time, scared and alone. The offer seemed like a miracle. The woman took her to a private apartment, gave her food and prenatal vitamins, and made sure she went to all her doctor appointments with Dr. Harrison. Jasmine said Dr. Harrison was kind to her, always professional, but he made it clear that she was signing over all rights to her baby in exchange for $50,000 and full medical care. At the time, Jasmine thought she was doing the right thing. She convinced herself that her baby would have a better life with a wealthy family. Dr. Harrison assured her that the couple desperately wanted a child and would give the baby everything she could not provide. The contract she signed was dozens of pages long, full of legal terms she did not understand. She was told not to tell anyone, especially not her family. The birth happened at a private clinic that Dr. Harrison operated separately from the main hospital. Jasmine was alone during labor except for 2 nurses and the doctor. She held her daughter for maybe 5 minutes before Dr. Harrison took the baby, saying it was better not to form attachments. Jasmine was given the money in cash kept at the clinic for 2 days, then dropped off at a bus station with a referral to a rehab facility. For weeks after, Jasmine cried herself to sleep, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. She used some of the money for rehab and sent the rest to Grace to hold for her. She was too ashamed to tell Grace what she had done until recently, when the guilt became too much to bear alone. Marcus paused the video, his hands shaking. This young woman had been preyed upon at her most vulnerable moment. Dr. Harrison had used her poverty and addiction as leverage to take her child. And Victoria had been willing to participate in this scheme rather than deal with the complications of actual adoption or fertility treatments. The forensic accountant, meanwhile, had been digging into Victoria's financial records. Marcus had given him access to their joint accounts and Victoria's personal accounts. What they found was damning. 6 months before Sophie's birth, Victoria had withdrawn $200,000 in increments carefully designed to avoid triggering banking alerts. The money had been funneled through several accounts before disappearing into cash withdrawals. Around the same time, Dr. Harrison had made a down payment on a vacation home in the Bahamas and had paid off his daughter's college loans in full. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. The investigation also revealed that this was not the first time Dr. Harrison had arranged private adoptions. There were at least 3 other cases in the past 5 years where wealthy couples had paid enormous sums for babies from vulnerable mothers. Marcus knew he had enough evidence to destroy both Victoria and Dr. Harrison, but he needed to be strategic. If he went to the authorities immediately, Victoria would hire the best lawyers money could buy and the case would drag on for years. Sophie would be caught in the middle, her origin story splashed across tabloids and news sites. That was unacceptable. Instead, Marcus decided to confront them directly and force their hand. He scheduled a dinner at the house for Thursday evening, telling Victoria they needed to discuss something important. He also invited Dr. Harrison under the pretense of a medical question about Sophie's development. Victoria seemed suspicious but agreed. Dr. Harrison, ever the professional, arrived at 7 with his medical bag, ready to examine the baby if needed. They gathered in the formal dining room, where Marcus had arranged for a private meal. The staff had been given the evening off. It was just the 3 of them and baby Sophie, who slept peacefully in a bassinet nearby. Marcus waited until after the first course had been served. Then he placed a folder on the table between them. Inside were photographs of Jasmine, copies of bank records, phone records showing calls between Victoria and Dr. Harrison, and a written statement from Jasmine describing everything. The color drained from Victoria's face. Dr. Harrison tried to maintain his composure, but Marcus could see the panic in his eyes. Marcus spoke calmly, laying out everything he had discovered. He described Jasmine's story in detail, the money trail and the other cases his investigators had uncovered. Victoria's response was immediate and aggressive. She stood up, knocking her chair backward, and accused Marcus of invading her privacy and making up ridiculous stories. She said Jasmine was clearly lying, probably hoping for more money. She turned to Dr. Harrison for support, but the doctor had gone very quiet. Marcus pulled out his phone and played the audio of Jasmine's interview. Her voice filled the room, describing the private clinic, the contract, the way Dr. Harrison had taken the baby from her arms. Victoria's denials became weaker. She started crying, saying she had only wanted a baby, that Marcus had been so focused on work that she felt alone, that she deserved to be a mother. Dr. Harrison finally spoke. His voice was defensive as he tried to justify his actions. He said he had helped women who would have otherwise ended up on the streets with their babies. He provided medical care and ensured the children went to good homes. He framed himself as a humanitarian, not a criminal. Marcus let them talk, let them try to rationalize and defend what they had done. Then he told them his terms. Victoria would agree to an immediate divorce and would give up all custody rights to Sophie. She would receive a modest settlement, enough to live comfortably but nothing close to what she would have gotten in a normal divorce. In exchange, Marcus would not press criminal charges or go to the media. Dr. Harrison would surrender his medical license voluntarily and would never practice medicine again. He would also establish a fund to compensate the mothers he had exploited, starting with Jasmine. He would pay for her continued rehabilitation and education. If he refused, Marcus would ensure that not only would he face criminal charges, but every detail of his operation would become public knowledge. Victoria tried to negotiate, tried to play on their history together, but Marcus was unmoved. He gave them both 24 hours to agree to his terms. If they refused, he would go to the police and the media simultaneously and let them deal with the consequences in the public eye. After they left, Marcus sat alone in the dining room, listening to Sophie's quiet breathing from the bassinet. He had won, or at least set the terms for victory, but the hardest part was still ahead. He needed to find Jasmine and figure out what role she would play in Sophie's life going forward. The next morning, Marcus drove to the rehabilitation facility alone. He had arranged a meeting with Jasmine through Sarah, his investigator. The facility was clean but modest, a far cry from the luxury Marcus was accustomed to. He was shown to a small visiting room where Jasmine waited, flanked by Grace and a counselor from the facility. Jasmine looked younger than 19, with dark eyes that seemed too old for her face. She was clearly terrified, picking at her fingernails and barely able to meet Marcus's gaze. Marcus sat down across from her and spoke gently, thanking her for agreeing to meet with him. He showed her pictures of Sophie on his phone, describing the baby's personality, her favorite toys, the way she smiled when she heard music. Jasmine's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the photos. She whispered that Sophie was beautiful, that she looked happy. Marcus told Jasmine that he wanted to do right by both her and Sophie. He explained his plans to ensure Dr. Harrison compensated her and offered to set up a trust fund for her education and future. But more importantly, he wanted to know what she wanted regarding Sophie. Jasmine broke down completely. Between sobs, she said she had given up her baby because she thought it was best, but she regretted it every day. She was not ready to be a mother then, and she was still working on getting her life together, but she wanted to know her daughter someday, when the time was right if Sophie wanted to know her. Marcus promised her that Sophie would know the truth when she was old enough to understand. He would make sure Jasmine's story was told with compassion, not judgment. He would help Jasmine build a stable life so that one day, if both she and Sophie wanted it, they could have a relationship. Grace, who had been quietly crying throughout the conversation, squeezed her sister's hand. Marcus told them both that they were part of Sophie's story now, and he would not erase that. He would honor the truth no matter how complicated it was. Within 48 hours, both Victoria and Dr. Harrison had signed the agreements Marcus put before them. Victoria's lawyer had tried to fight for better terms, but when Marcus made it clear that he would expose everything if she did not comply, he relented. The divorce papers were filed quietly, with a carefully worded statement about irreconcilable differences. Victoria moved out of the mansion within a week, taking only her personal belongings and the settlement money Marcus had offered. Dr. Harrison's capitulation was even swifter. The doctor knew that criminal charges would not only destroy his career, but likely result in prison time. He surrendered his medical license to the state board, citing personal health reasons. The board accepted his resignation without investigation, unaware of the real circumstances. Marcus's lawyers drew up contracts ensuring Dr. Harrison would pay $100,000 to Jasmine immediately, with an additional $50,000 set aside for her education expenses. But Marcus did not stop there. His investigators had identified 3 other women who had been part of Dr. Harrison's scheme. 2 were willing to come forward once they understood they would not face legal consequences. Marcus arranged for Dr. Harrison to compensate each of them as well, draining a significant portion of the doctor's savings and forcing him to sell his vacation home and luxury car. The hardest part was deciding what to tell Sophie as she grew up. Marcus consulted with child psychologists and adoption specialists. They all agreed that Sophie deserved to know the truth, but it needed to be age-appropriate and delivered with care. For now, while she was still an infant, Marcus focused on being the best father he could be. He scaled back his work hours dramatically, much to the shock of his executive team. He hired a new nanny, but made sure to spend several hours each day caring for Sophie himself. He fed her bottles, changed her diapers, sang to her off-key lullabies, and marveled at every new sound she made. The bond between them grew stronger each day. Grace continued to work for Marcus part-time, helping with Sophie's care. It gave her a chance to be close to her niece, even if she could not publicly claim that relationship yet. Marcus paid for Jasmine's continued rehabilitation and enrolled her in online college courses. She was studying social work, hoping to one day help other young women avoid the situation she had found herself in. 3 months after the confrontation, Marcus received an unexpected call from one of Dr. Harrison's former nurses. The woman, whose name was Patricia, said she had worked at the private clinic where the illegal adoptions took place. She had kept quiet because she needed the job and Dr. Harrison paid well, but her conscience had been bothering her for years. Patricia told Marcus that there were detailed records of all the adoptions, including the biological mother's medical histories, the amounts paid, and the identities of the adoptive parents. Dr. Harrison had kept meticulous files, perhaps as insurance or simply out of professional habit. Patricia knew where these files were hidden in storage. Marcus immediately sent his investigators to retrieve the documents. What they found was even more extensive than expected. Dr. Harrison had been running this operation for nearly a decade. There were at least 15 cases documented in detail. Some of the adoptive parents were celebrities, politicians, and business leaders. Some of the biological mothers had been teenagers. Others were women struggling with addiction or homelessness. In every case, Dr. Harrison had exploited their desperation. Marcus faced a difficult decision. He could take these files to the authorities and potentially help reunite other children with their biological mothers, or at least ensure those mothers received compensation, but doing so would inevitably expose Sophie's story to the world. Every media outlet would cover the scandal. Sophie would grow up knowing that everyone knew her origin story. He spent sleepless nights wrestling with this choice. Finally, he consulted with Jasmine. She had grown stronger over the months, her eyes clearer, her voice more confident. When Marcus explained the situation, she did not hesitate. Jasmine said that other women deserved to know what happened to their babies. Other children deserved to know the truth about their origins, even if it was painful. She was willing to have her story made public if it meant justice for others. She had made mistakes and been exploited, but she was done hiding in shame. Her courage inspired Marcus. Together with his legal team, they approached the district attorney's office. They presented the evidence carefully, explaining the scope of Dr. Harrison's operation. The DA was initially skeptical, but as she reviewed the documents and heard the testimonies, she realized this was one of the most significant adoption fraud cases the state had ever seen. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. Every major news outlet picked it up within hours. The headlines screamed about the respected doctor who had sold babies to wealthy clients. Photographs of Dr. Harrison's mansion and private clinic appeared alongside stories from the mothers he had exploited. Marcus's involvement was inevitable. Reporters discovered that his ex-wife Victoria had been one of Dr. Harrison's clients. They camped outside his mansion, shouting questions about Sophie. Marcus released a statement through his lawyers, acknowledging that he had been deceived but was committed to ensuring justice for all the victims. He requested privacy for his daughter while she was still an infant. Jasmine gave an interview to a respected journalist, telling her story with remarkable composure. She spoke about her struggles with addiction, the vulnerability that Dr. Harrison had exploited, and her journey to recovery. She talked about her daughter being raised by a man who, despite not being her biological father, loved her completely. The interview was powerful and shifted public sympathy toward the birth mothers rather than judgment. Other mothers began to come forward. A woman whose baby had been taken 7 years ago saw the news and realized what had happened to her son. She had been told the baby died shortly after birth, but Dr. Harrison had actually sold him to a couple in another state. The reunion between mother and child, facilitated by Marcus's legal team, made national news and further exposed the depth of Dr. Harrison's crimes. Dr. Harrison was arrested and charged with multiple counts of fraud, practicing medicine without properly documenting adoptions, and exploitation of vulnerable individuals. His trial was set for 6 months later. Victoria was also questioned by authorities, but because she had signed Marcus's agreement, she avoided criminal charges. However, her reputation in society was destroyed. The charities she had worked with quietly removed her from their boards. Her friends stopped returning her calls. Marcus shielded Sophie from all of it as much as possible. He moved temporarily to a more secure property outside the city, away from the media circus. He hired security to ensure they had privacy. He maintained Sophie's routines, making sure she felt safe and loved despite the chaos surrounding them. During this time, Marcus also established a foundation to help other children and mothers affected by similar situations. He donated $5 million to start, with plans to grow the fund substantially. The foundation provided legal assistance for families trying to navigate complicated adoption situations, counseling services for birth mothers dealing with trauma, and educational scholarships for young women aging out of the foster care system. Jasmine became one of the foundation's first employees once she completed her initial course of study. Her role was to provide peer support to other birth mothers, helping them understand their rights and navigate the emotional complexity of their situations. Working with the foundation gave her purpose and helped her continue healing from her own trauma. 6 months after the scandal broke, Marcus was finally able to return to some semblance of normal life. The media attention had died down and Dr. Harrison's trial was proceeding. Marcus divided his time between his company, which had weathered the storm thanks to his strong leadership team, and caring for Sophie, who was now 9 months old and starting to crawl. One evening, Marcus sat in Sophie's nursery watching her play with colorful blocks on the floor. She babbled happily, occasionally looking up at him with a grin that made his heart swell. Grace was there too, sitting in the rocking chair and smiling at her niece. Marcus thought about how much had changed in less than a year. He had lost his wife, though that relationship had been hollow anyway. He had lost some of his privacy, and had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the world he lived in. But he had gained so much more. He had a daughter who he loved beyond measure. He had developed a genuine friendship with Jasmine and Grace, who he now considered family. He had found a purpose beyond making money, using his resources to help others in meaningful ways. He had learned that being a father meant protecting your child not just from physical harm, but also from lies and deception, even when the truth was complicated. Sophie crawled over to him and pulled herself up using his leg, a new skill she was very proud of. Marcus picked her up and held her close. She rested her head on his shoulder, her tiny hand gripping his shirt. In that moment, Marcus knew that every difficult decision had been worth it. Sophie would grow up knowing the truth about where she came from, but she would also know without doubt that she was loved, wanted, and cherished. Dr. Harrison's trial began on a cold morning in November. The courthouse was packed with journalists, former patients, and people who had followed the case from the beginning. Marcus attended every day of the trial, sitting quietly in the back row. He wanted to see justice served, not just for Sophie and Jasmine, but for all the families that had been torn apart by the doctor's greed. The prosecution built a devastating case. They called witness after witness, each telling a story of vulnerability exploited. A mother who had been homeless and pregnant testified about signing papers she did not understand, only to have her baby taken away minutes after birth. Another woman described how Dr. Harrison had convinced her that her drug use made her unfit to parent, never mentioning that he was arranging a private adoption for profit. The adoptive parents were also called to testify. Some claimed they had no idea the adoptions were illegal, believing Dr. Harrison when he said everything was properly documented. Others admitted they had asked few questions because they were desperate for a child and willing to pay any price. Their testimonies revealed a network of wealthy people who had been willing to look the other way as long as they got what they wanted. Marcus found himself feeling unexpected sympathy for some of these parents. They had bonded with children who were not biologically theirs, just as he had with Sophie. Now they faced the possibility of losing those children or having their relationships forever complicated by legal battles and moral questions. He understood their pain, even while recognizing that what they had participated in was wrong. Dr. Harrison's defense attorney tried to paint his client as a doctor who had genuinely believed he was helping both desperate mothers and infertile couples. The lawyer argued that the mothers had willingly signed contracts and received substantial compensation. He suggested that Dr. Harrison's only crime was failing to follow proper adoption procedures, not exploiting vulnerable women. The jury did not buy it. After 3 weeks of testimony and 2 days of deliberation, they returned a guilty verdict on all counts. Dr. Harrison showed no emotion as the verdict was read, but his wife, sitting behind him, burst into tears. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution to every mother he had exploited. The day after the sentencing, Marcus received a letter from Dr. Harrison's attorney. Inside was a handwritten note from the doctor himself. Marcus almost threw it away without reading, but curiosity got the better of him. The letter was not an apology exactly. Instead, Dr. Harrison wrote about how he had started with good intentions, wanting to help women who felt they had no options, and couples who desperately wanted children. He described how the first few cases had seemed like everybody won. The mothers got money and medical care, the babies got stable homes, and the adoptive parents got the families they longed for. But then it became about the money. The houses, the cars, the lifestyle he had built. Each case became easier to justify because he convinced himself he was providing a service. He stopped seeing the mothers as real people with complex feelings and started seeing them as transactions. He wrote that he deserved his punishment and hoped Marcus would raise Sophie to be a better person than he had been. Marcus folded the letter and put it in a folder with all the other documents related to the case. He did not forgive Dr. Harrison, but he understood how good people could make terrible choices when they prioritized the wrong things. It was a lesson he would carry with him and one day share with Sophie. Life began to settle into a new normal. Marcus had hired additional staff to help run his company so he could maintain a better work-life balance. Sophie was thriving, a happy toddler who loved books, music, and anything that made noise. Marcus had become skilled at functioning on limited sleep and could now change a diaper with one hand while answering business emails with the other. Jasmine continued her education and work with the foundation. She had been clean for over a year and was rebuilding her life with determination that impressed everyone who knew her. She had moved into a small apartment that Marcus helped her secure, decorated with photographs and plants that she tended carefully. Grace visited her several times a week, and slowly their relationship healed from the pain of Jasmine's disappearance and the secrets she had kept. The question of Jasmine's role in Sophie's life remained complicated. Marcus had established supervised visits where Jasmine could spend time with Sophie under Grace's watchful eye. At first, these visits were difficult for Jasmine. She would hold Sophie and cry, overwhelmed by love and regret. But gradually, she learned to be present in the moment, to enjoy Sophie's giggles and curiosity without drowning in what-ifs. Sophie, too young to understand the complexity of her situation, simply knew that Jasmine was someone who visited sometimes and made everyone emotional. She liked Jasmine well enough, especially when she brought books or sang songs. There was no biological recognition, no instant bond, just a toddler accepting another adult in her world. Marcus watched these visits carefully, sometimes feeling jealous of the biological connection Jasmine had to Sophie, sometimes feeling guilty that he had what Jasmine should have had. But mostly he felt grateful that Sophie would grow up knowing all the people who loved her, even if the relationships were unconventional. One afternoon, during a visit at a park near Marcus's home, a woman approached their group. She was one of the other mothers from Dr. Harrison's case, someone Marcus had seen at the trial but never spoken to directly. Her name was Christina, and her son had been adopted 5 years earlier by a couple in California. Christina thanked Marcus for having the courage to expose Dr. Harrison. Because of the trial, she had been able to locate her son and establish contact with his adoptive parents. They were working with lawyers and counselors to figure out how to navigate the situation in a way that prioritized the child's well-being. It was messy and emotional, but it was better than not knowing where her son was or if he was okay. She told Marcus that a support group had formed for the mothers affected by the case. They met monthly to share their experiences and help each other heal. Several of the mothers had been able to establish some form of contact with their children. Others had decided that maintaining distance was healthier for everyone involved. There was no one right answer, but having the support of people who understood made the journey easier. Jasmine had joined the group and found it incredibly helpful. Hearing from mothers who were years ahead of her in processing their experiences gave her hope that the pain would eventually become more manageable. She learned strategies for dealing with grief and guilt. She made friends who did not judge her for the choices she had made when she was desperate and sick. As Sophie's second birthday approached, Marcus began planning a celebration. He wanted it to be special but not overwhelming, with just close friends and family. The guest list included his parents, who had been initially shocked by the scandal but had rallied around their son and granddaughter. It included Grace, who had become like a sister to Marcus. It included Jasmine, whose presence was no longer awkward but welcomed. The party was held in Marcus's backyard on a sunny afternoon. Sophie wore a purple dress and a tiny crown. Delighted by all the attention, she smashed her hands into a cake shaped like her favorite cartoon character, while adults sang and took photographs. It was a normal birthday party, the kind that happened in backyards across the country every weekend. But for Marcus, watching Sophie laugh and play, surrounded by people who had fought for her and for truth, it was extraordinary. 2 years ago, he had been living a lie. Married to a woman who saw children as acquisitions rather than responsibilities. He had been so focused on building his business empire that he had nearly missed what really mattered. That night, after the guests had left and Sophie was asleep, Marcus sat in his study reviewing the Foundation's latest reports. They had helped 23 families navigate complicated adoption situations. They had provided scholarships to 12 young women pursuing education. They had funded counseling services for 37 mothers dealing with trauma related to adoption, exploitation, or loss. The numbers were meaningful, but Marcus knew that behind each statistic was a real person whose life had been touched by the Foundation's work. He thought about the chain of events that had led to this moment. If Grace had not been sent as a substitute nanny, if she had not recognized Sophie, if she had chosen to stay silent, none of this would have happened. Sophie would still be his daughter, but she would be growing up surrounded by lies. Jasmine would still be carrying the weight of her secret, never knowing if her daughter was okay. Dr. Harrison would still be exploiting vulnerable women. And Marcus would still be the man who prioritized business over everything else, living a hollow life with a wife who did not love him. Sometimes the truth hurt. Sometimes it was messy and complicated, and created problems that seemed impossible to solve. But it was always better than a lie, no matter how comfortable that lie might be. Marcus had learned that lesson the hard way, and it had changed everything. 5 years had passed since the scandal that had turned Marcus's world upside down. Sophie was now 7 years old, attending an excellent private school where she excelled in art and music. She had Marcus's determination and Jasmine's creative spirit, though she did not fully understand that connection yet. Marcus had always been honest with her in age-appropriate ways, and the time was approaching when she would need to know the complete truth. Jasmine had graduated from college with a degree in social work and was now the director of outreach programs for Marcus's foundation. She had been clean for over 6 years, a milestone she celebrated quietly with Grace and her counselor. She had her own apartment, a small but cozy space filled with artwork that Sophie had made for her over the years. The relationship between Jasmine and Sophie had evolved into something like an aunt and niece, though both knew there was something deeper beneath the surface. Grace had become Sophie's primary nanny, and was considered part of the family. She had been there for every milestone, every scraped knee, every school performance. Her love for Sophie was fierce and protective, and Sophie adored her in return. Marcus often thought about how one person's courage to speak the truth had saved so many lives. Victoria had disappeared from their lives entirely. She had moved to Europe shortly after the trial, remarried quickly to another wealthy man, and rarely communicated with anyone from her old life. Marcus had heard through mutual acquaintances that she had 2 stepchildren now, and seemed content to forget about her past. Sophie occasionally asked about her, and Marcus answered honestly that Victoria had made choices that hurt people and had decided to start over somewhere else. Dr. Harrison was serving his sentence at a medium-security prison upstate. Marcus had visited him once 2 years into his sentence, though he still did not fully understand why he felt compelled to go. The doctor looked older, diminished by the prison uniform and the loss of everything he had built. They had talked for 30 minutes, mostly about Sophie and the other children affected by his crimes. Harrison expressed genuine remorse, though Marcus knew that remorse did not undo the damage. The foundation continued to grow. They had expanded their services to include prevention programs, working with high schools and community centers to educate young people about predatory adoption practices and their rights. They partnered with rehab facilities to provide support for pregnant women struggling with addiction, ensuring they had options beyond exploitation. They had helped reunite 6 families completely and facilitated healthy co-parenting arrangements in a dozen other cases. But for all the good work and healing that had happened, Marcus knew there was one conversation he could not put off any longer. Sophie was getting older and asking more questions. She had noticed that she looked different from Marcus, that her skin was darker and her hair had a different texture. She had started asking about her mother, and Marcus's explanations about Victoria were clearly not satisfying her curiosity. Marcus consulted with the child psychologist who had been advising him since Sophie was an infant. Together, they planned how to tell Sophie the truth about her origin in a way that would help her understand without traumatizing her. They decided that it should happen at home, in a comfortable environment with both Marcus and Jasmine present. Grace would be nearby for support. On a Saturday morning in spring, Marcus made Sophie's favorite breakfast and suggested they spend some special time together. Sophie, always perceptive, immediately knew something important was happening. She sat at the kitchen table, her eyes wide and serious, waiting for whatever Marcus needed to tell her. Marcus began by reminding Sophie how much he loved her, that nothing he was about to say would change that. He explained that families came in many different forms, and that biology was just one part of what made people connected to each other. Sophie listened intently, her small hands folded on the table in front of her. Then Marcus told her the truth. He explained that Victoria was not her biological mother, that another woman named Jasmine had given birth to her. He told her about how Jasmine had been very young and struggling, and how a doctor had taken advantage of that situation. He made it clear that none of what happened was Jasmine's fault, and that Jasmine had always loved her even when she could not take care of her. Sophie's first question was whether Marcus was her real father. The fear in her voice nearly broke his heart. Marcus assured her that he was her father in every way that mattered, even if they did not share DNA. He had been there for her from the very beginning, had loved her from the first moment he held her, and would love her forever. Sophie cried, which Marcus had expected. She had questions, so many questions, and Marcus answered each one patiently. When she asked if Jasmine was the nice lady who visited and worked with the foundation, Marcus confirmed that she was. Sophie was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Then she asked if she could talk to Jasmine. Marcus had hoped she would ask that. He called Jasmine, who had been waiting nervously at her apartment, and asked her to come over. While they waited, Marcus held Sophie close, letting her cry and ask more questions. He showed her photographs from when she was a baby, pointing out all the people who had loved her from the start. When Jasmine arrived, she was shaking with nerves. She sat down across from Sophie, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Sophie studied her biological mother's face, perhaps seeing herself in Jasmine's features for the first time. Jasmine's eyes filled with tears, but she held them back, not wanting to make this moment about her own emotions. Sophie asked Jasmine why she had given her away. It was the question Jasmine had been dreading and preparing for in therapy for years. She answered honestly, explaining that she had been very sick with addiction, that she did not think she could take care of a baby properly, and that a doctor had convinced her it was the best thing for everyone. She told Sophie that she thought about her every single day, and that giving her up was the hardest thing she had ever done. Sophie asked if Jasmine still loved her. Jasmine's composure finally broke. Through tears, she told Sophie that she loved her more than anything in the world, that knowing she was happy and safe was what had helped Jasmine get better and build a new life. She apologized for not being strong enough to keep her, for making a choice that hurt them both. Sophie was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that surprised everyone in the room. She said that maybe it was okay, because she had Marcus, who was the best dad ever, and she had Grace, who was like another mom, and now she knew Jasmine too. She said it was confusing, but maybe it was also special to have so many people who loved her. The adults in the room were stunned by the 7-year-old's wisdom. Marcus pulled both Sophie and Jasmine into a hug, and they stayed like that for a long time, crying together but also healing together. It was not a fairy tale ending where everything was suddenly perfect, but it was a beginning of a new kind of family structure. Over the following months, Sophie and Jasmine spent more time together. They did art projects, baked cookies, and took walks in the park. Jasmine was careful not to overstep her role, understanding that Marcus was Sophie's father, and that her own role was something different and still being defined. But Sophie seemed to thrive with the knowledge of where she came from, and the ability to know all the people connected to her story. School became a bit complicated when Sophie shared her story with friends. Some parents reacted with judgment or concern, but Sophie's teacher, informed by Marcus ahead of time, helped navigate these conversations. She led a classroom discussion about different types of families, helping the children understand that families could be built in many ways. Sophie became something of an advocate among her peers, defending other children whose families did not fit traditional molds. Marcus watched his daughter navigate these challenges with pride. She had inherited his strength, but also developed a compassion and openness that he was still learning from her. She understood that people made mistakes, that circumstances could be complicated, and that love did not have to look like what television shows and movies portrayed. The foundation held its annual gala in the fall, a fundraising event that attracted donors and supporters from across the state. For the first time, Sophie attended with Marcus. She was old enough now to understand what the foundation did and why it mattered. She met other children who had been affected by adoption fraud, some who had been reunited with their biological families, and others who were still navigating complex situations. Sophie also met Christina, the woman who had approached them at the park years earlier. Christina's son, now 10, was there too. He and Sophie talked about their experiences, finding comfort in knowing someone else who understood the unique complexity of their situations. Marcus watched them interact and felt hopeful about the future. During the gala speeches, Jasmine took the stage to talk about the foundation's work. She spoke about her own journey, about the mistakes she had made and the system that had exploited her vulnerability. She talked about the importance of supporting women in crisis rather than taking advantage of them. She talked about the children who deserve to know the truth about their origins, no matter how complicated that truth might be. Then she did something unexpected. She called Sophie up to the stage. Sophie, wearing a blue dress that made her look older than her 7 years, walked up confidently. Jasmine introduced her to the audience as her daughter, as the reason she got clean and stayed clean, as the inspiration for all the work the foundation did. Sophie spoke into the microphone, her voice clear and strong. She said that her family was different from some families, but that different did not mean bad. She said she had a dad who loved